So I'm Dan Baker. This is Comrade Meow's Communist Audiobooks. I'm about to have a little reading from What is Marxism for my daily routine of reading ideology and listening to ideology. Then I'll do my meditation, yoga, martial arts. So because I'm an atheist and I practice an atheist form of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism basically, just sitting and relaxing, listening, focusing on the breath and what I'm listening to. I listen to socialist ideology, socialist audiobooks, and I'll be listening to audiobooks of Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, because he gave us a step-by-step plan for how to prepare for revolutions which spontaneously occur every so often throughout history, like an earthquake or a tsunami. We know these are going to happen. So I was just doing some other studying, and before I start, I'm going to write out my little plan about what martial arts routine I'm going to do. I'm going to do meditation, yoga, martial arts while listening to Lenin audiobooks. Please don't laugh, I cut my own hair because I'm trying to survive, and I live paycheck to paycheck like many Americans do. So I will write out my workout here real quick. Today is October 29th, 2025. Please like, share, and subscribe so that I can keep doing this. I don't get paid. If you want to help me out, that would be great. But I just do this to try to share ideology, audiobooks, and to give people a daily routine of meditation, yoga, martial arts, and reading that they can connect with wherever they're at. So when we start today, we're going to be starting on the unprecedented advance of Marxism in the section called What is Historical Materialism? And we'll be reading about capitalism in decline, moving from necessity to freedom. And then I might read from the letter to J. Bloch in London, September 21st, 1890 by Frederick Engels. I'm not sure. That's pretty short, so we'll definitely read that. So we've got some letters from Engels, and short essays by Marx, and then we'll be finishing section 2, which I think we'll be able to do here now. So we'll begin the reading here in just a minute. I'm just writing out some notes about which martial arts exercises and bodyweight exercises I'm going to do here. So I have that all ready to go. And now we're going to read. So please like, share, and subscribe. I'll figure out a financial thing for this channel one day. But right now I'm just doing this because I will always share my daily routine of meditation, yoga, martial arts for free. Unprecedented advance. Every phase of human development has its roots in all previous development. This is true of both human evolution and social development. We have evolved from lower species and are generally genetically related to even the most primitive life forms, as the human genome has conclusively proved. We have emerged from savagery, barbarism, slavery, and feudalism, and each of these stages represented a definite stage in the development of the productive forces in culture. Hegel expressed this idea in a beautiful passage in Phenomenology of Mind. The bud disappears when the blossom breaks through, and we might say that the former is refuted by the latter. In the same way, when the fruit comes, the blossom may be explained to be a false form of the plant's existence, for the fruit appears as its true nature in place of the blossom. These stages are not merely differentiated, they supplant one another as being incompatible with one another, but the ceaseless activity of their own inherent nature makes these stage moments of an organic entity where they not merely do not contradict one another, but where one is as necessary as the other and constitutes thereby the life of the whole. I'll repeat that because I stammered a little. But the ceaseless activity of their own inherent nature makes these stages moments of an organic unity, where they do not merely contradict one another, but where one is as necessary as the other and constitutes thereby the life of the whole. One of the reasons I read is so that I can be better at reading and speaking. Every stage of the development of society is rooted in necessity and emerges out of the preceding stages. History can only be understood if these stages are taken in their unity. Each had its raison d'être in the development of the productive forces, and each entered into contradiction with their further development at a certain stage, when a revolution was necessary to cast off the old forms and allow new forms to emerge. As we have seen, the victory of the bourgeoisie was achieved by revolutionary means, though nowadays the defenders of capitalism do not like to be reminded of the fact. And as Marx and Engels explained, the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary role. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered forms was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty, and agitation distinguished the bourgeois epoch from its earlier ones. Under capitalism, the productive forces have experienced spectacular development, unprecedented in the history of mankind, despite the fact that capitalism is the most exploitative and oppressive system that has ever existed, despite the fact that, in Marx's words, capital came onto the stage of history dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. It nevertheless represented a colossal leap forward in the development of the productive forces, and therefore of our power over nature. During the last 2 centuries, the development of technology and science has proceeded at a far faster rate than in all previous history. The curve of human development, which was virtually flat for most of our history, suddenly experienced a steep ascent. The dizzying progress of technology is the precondition for the final emancipation of humankind, the abolition of poverty, illiteracy, ignorance, disease, and the domination of nature by man through conscious planning of the economy. The road is open to conquest, not only on Earth, but in space. The next section is called Capitalism in Decline. Again, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. I filter all the comments, so deal with it. Capitalism in Decline. It is the illusion of every epoch that it will last forever. Every social system believes that it represents the only possible form of existence for human beings, that its institutions, its religions, its morality are the last word that could be spoken. That is what the cannibals, the Egyptian priests, Marie Antoinette, and Tsar Nicholas II all fervently believed, and that is what the bourgeoisie and its apologists today wish to demonstrate when they assure us, without the slightest basis, that the so-called system of free enterprise is the only possible system, just when it is beginning to show all the signs of senile decay. The capitalist system today resembles the sorcerer's apprentice, who conjured up powerful forces which he could not control. The fundamental contradiction of capitalist society is the antagonism between the social nature of production and the private form of appropriation. From this central contradiction, many others arise. This contradiction is expressed by periodic crisis, as Marx and Engels explained. In these crises, a great part, not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if famine, a universal war of demonstration had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seemed to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered. And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois property are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeois get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crisis, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. You can see this in the destruction of so much food that could be distributed, and we're trying to get our hands on it in America. People dumpster dive, people create these food pantries for somewhat expired or bruised fruit and so on, and we distribute it. But then they put a lock on the dumpster, and you get attacked by the police or security if you try to get that food that is still good and clean it and distribute it. Going on. This is an exact description of the present situation. It is a terrible paradox that the more humanity develops its productive capacity, the more spectacular the advances of science and technology, the greater the suffering, starvation, oppression, and misery of the majority of the world's population. The sickness of capitalism on a world scale manifested itself in the collapse of 2008. This was the beginning of the biggest crisis in the entire 200-year existence of capitalism, and it is far from being resolved. This is an expression of the impasse of capitalism, which in the last analysis is a result of the revolt of the productive forces against the straitjacket of private property and the nation state. Socialism or barbarism. For thousands of years, culture has been the monopoly of a privileged minority, while the vast majority of humanity were excluded from knowledge, science, art, and government. Even now, this remains the case. Despite all our pretensions, we are not really civilized. The world we live in now certainly does not merit the name. It is a barbaric world, inhabited by people who have yet to overcome a barbarous past. Life remains a harsh and unrelenting struggle to exist for the great majority of the planet, not only in the underdeveloped, but also in the developed capitalist countries as well. Engels pointed out that there were two possibilities before the human race, socialism or barbarism. The question is therefore posed in the starkest terms. In the coming period, either the working class will take into its hands the running of society, replacing the decrepit capitalist system with a new social order based on the harmonious and rational planning of the productive forces, and the conscious control of men and women over their own lives and destinies, or else we will be faced with the most frightful spectacle of social, economic, and cultural collapse. The crisis of capitalism represents not just an economic crisis, but threatens jobs and living standards of millions of people throughout the world. It also threatens the very basis of a civilized existence, insofar that this exists. It threatens to throw humankind back on all fronts. If the proletariat, the only genuinely revolutionary class, does not succeed in overthrowing the rule of the banks and monopolies, the stage will be set for a collapse of culture and even a return to barbarism. Dialectics teaches us that the sooner or later things change into their opposite. It is possible to draw parallels between geology and society. Just as the tectonic plates, having moved too slowly, compensate the delay by a violent earthquake, so the lagging of consciousness behind events is compensated by sudden changes in the psychology of the masses. The most striking manifestation of dialectics is the crisis of capitalism itself. Dialectics are taking their revenge on the bourgeois who have understood nothing, predicted nothing, and are capable of solving nothing. The collapse of the Soviet Union created a mood of pessimism and despair among the working class. The defenders of capitalism launched a ferocious ideological counteroffensive against the ideas of socialism and Marxism. They promised us a future of peace, prosperity, and democracy thanks to the wonders of the free market economy. 2 decades have passed since then, and a decade is not such a long time in the grand scheme of history, and not one stone upon another now remains of these comforting illusions. Everywhere there is war, unemployment, poverty, and hunger. And everywhere a new spirit of revolt is arising, and people are looking for ideas that can explain what is happening in the world. The old, stable, peaceful, prosperous capitalism is dead, and with it, the old, peaceful, harmonious relations between the classes. The future will be one of years and decades of austerity, unemployment, and falling living standards. That is a finished recipe for a revival of the class struggle everywhere. The embryo of a new society is already maturing within the womb of the old. The elements of a workers' democracy already exist in the form of workers' organizations, the shop stewards' committees, the trade unions, the cooperatives, etc. In the period that opens up, there will be a life and death struggle, a struggle of those elements of the new society to be born, an equally fierce resistance on the part of the old order to prevent this from happening. It is true that the consciousness of the masses have been lagging far behind events, but that also will change into its opposite. Great events are forcing men and women to question their old beliefs and assumptions. They are being jolted out of the old supine, apathetic indifference and forced to stand up and come to terms with reality. We can see this process emerging all over the world. In such periods, consciousness can very rapidly change, and that is just what a revolution is. The rise of modern capitalism and of its gravedigger, the working class, has made much clearer what is at the heart of the materialist concept of history. Our task is not merely to understand, but to bring to a successful conclusion the historical struggle of the classes by means of the victory of the proletariat and the socialist transformation of society. Capitalism has failed, after all, to end history. The task of Marxists is to work actively to hasten the overthrow of the old decrepit system and to bring about the birth of a new and better world. I'm going to drink some caffeine and some water here because that was a really nice section. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm reading What is Marxism, which comes from the Revolutionary Communists of America, of which I am a sympathizer and a financial contributor. The next section is called From Necessity to Freedom. The scientific approach to history that historical materialism gives us does not incline us to draw pessimistic conclusions from the horrific symptoms of decline that confronts us on all sides. On the contrary, the general tendency of human history has been in the direction of even greater development of our productive and cultural potential. The relation between the development of human culture and the productive forces was already clear to that great genius of antiquity, Aristotle, who explained in his book Metaphysics that the theoretical arts, such as philosophy, evolved in the places where men had plenty of free time, and added that the reason why astronomy and mathematics were discovered in Egypt is because, quote, a priestly caste enjoyed the necessary leisure. This is a purely materialist understanding of history. The great achievement of the last 100 years have for the first time created a situation where all the problems facing humankind can easily be solved. The potential for a classless society already exists on a world scale. What is necessary is to bring about a rational and harmonious planning of the productive forces in order that this immense, practically infinite potential can be realized. Once the productive forces are freed from the straitjacket of capitalism, the potential exists to produce a great number of geniuses, artists, writers, composers, philosophers, scientists, and architects. Art, science, and culture would flower as never before. This rich, beautiful, and wonderfully diverse world would at last become a place fit for human beings to live in. In a certain sense, Socialist society is a return to primitive tribal communism, but on a vastly higher productive level. Before one can envisage a classless society, all the hallmarks of class society, especially inequality and scarcity, would have to be abolished. It would be absurd to talk of the abolition of classes, where inequality, scarcity, and the struggle for existence prevailed. It would be a contradiction in terms. Socialism can only appear at a certain stage in the evolution of human society, at a certain level of development of the productive forces. On the basis of a real revolution in production, it would be possible to achieve such a level of abundance that men and women would no longer have to worry about their everyday necessities. The humiliating concerns and fears that fill every thinking hour of men and women now will disappear. For the first time, free human beings will be masters of their destinies. For the first time, they will be really human. Only then will the real history of the human race begin. On the basis of a harmonious land economy in which the tremendous productive power of science and technology will be harnessed for the satisfaction of human needs, not the profits of a few, culture will reach new and undreamed of levels of development. The Romans described slaves as tools with voices. Nowadays, we do not need to enslave people to do the work. We already have the technology to create robots that can not only play chess and perform elementary tasks on production lines, but even carry out quite complex tasks. On the basis of capitalism, this technology threatens to displace millions of workers, not only lorry drivers and unskilled workers, but people like accountants and computer programmers are threatened with losing their livelihoods. Millions will be thrown on the scrap heap, while those who retain their jobs will be working longer hours than before. Or in my case, they cut your hours and you have to beg for more and more hours. And nobody wants to give you full time, and it becomes impossible to pay the bills. In a socialist planned economy, that same technology would be used to reduce the working day. We could immediately introduce a 30-hour week, followed by a 20-hour week, a 10-hour week, or even less, while increasing production and expanding the wealth of society far more than what is conceivable under capitalism. This would represent a fundamental change in people's lives. For the first time, men and women would be freed from the drudgery of labor. They would be free to develop themselves physically, mentally, and one might even add spiritually. Men and women will be able to lift their eyes to the heavens and contemplate the stars. Trotsky once wrote, "How many Aristotles are herding swine, and how many swineherds wear a crown on their heads?" Class society impoverishes people, not just materially, but psychologically. The lives of millions of human beings are confined to the narrowest limits. Their mental horizons are stunted. Socialism would release all the colossal potential that is being wasted by capitalism. It is true that people have different characters and aptitudes. Not everyone can be an Aristotle, a Beethoven, or an Einstein, but everyone has the potential to do great things in one field or another, to become a great scientist, artist, musician, dancer, or footballer. Communism will provide all the conditions needed to develop those potentials to the fullest extent. This would be the greatest revolution of all time. It would carry human civilization to a new and qualitatively superior level. In the words of Engels, it would be humankind's leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. This ends the section on what is historical materialism. I'm now reading Letter to J. Bloch, London, September 21st, 1890, by Frederick Engels. According to materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. Other than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., juridical forms, and even the reflexes of all of these actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas, also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles, and in many cases preponderate in determining their forms. There is an interaction of all of these elements in which, amid the endless hosts of accidents, that is, of things and events whose interconnection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can guard it as non-existent as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary. Otherwise, the application of the theory to any period of history would be easier than the solution of a simple equation of the first degree. We make our history ourselves, but in the first place, under every definite assumptions and conditions. Among these, the economic ones are ultimately decisive, but the political ones, etc., and indeed, even the traditions which haunt the human mind also play a part, although not the decisive one. The Prussian state also arose and developed from historical and ultimately economic causes, but it could scarcely be maintained without pedantry that among the many small states of North Germany, Brandenburg was specifically determined by economic necessity to become the great power embodying the economic, linguistic, and after the Reformation, also the religious difference between the North and South, and not by other elements as well. Above all by its entanglement with Poland, owing to the possession of Prussia, and hence with the international political relations, which were indeed also decisive in the formation of the Austrian dynastic power. Without making oneself ridiculous, it would be a difficult thing to explain in terms of economics the existence of every small state in Germany, past and present, or the origins of the High Germanic consonants permutations, which widened the geographic partition wall formed by the mountains of the Sudetic range to the Tonnins to form a regular fissure across all Germany. In the second place, however, history is made in such a way that the final result always arises from conflicts between many individual wills, of which each in turn has been made what it is by a host of particular conditions of life. Thus, there are innumerable intersecting forces, an infinite series of parallelograms of forces, which give rise to one resultant, the historical event. This may again itself be viewed as the product of a power which works as a whole unconsciously and without volition, for what each individual wills is obstructed by everyone else's, and what emerges is something that no one willed. Thus, history has proceeded hitherto in the manner of a natural process, and is essentially subject to the same laws of motion. But from the fact that the wills of individuals, each of whom desires what he is impelled to by his physical constitution and external, in the last resort, economic circumstances, either his own personal circumstances or those of society in general, do not attain what they want, but are merged into an aggregate mean, a common resultant. It must not be concluded that they are equal to zero. On the contrary, each contributes to the resultant, and is to this extent included in it. I would furthermore ask you to study this theory from its original sources, and not its second hand. It is really much easier. Marx hardly wrote anything in which it did not play a part, but especially the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte is a most excellent example of its application. There are also many allusions to it in Capital. Then, may I also direct you to my writings? Forgive my pronunciation of this German name. Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science, the Anti-Düring, and Ludwig Feuerbach at the end of Classical German Philosophy, in which I have given the most detailed account of historical material which, as far as I know, exists. Marx and I are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We had to emphasize the main principle vis-a-vis our adversaries who denied it, and we had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to give their due to the other elements involved in the interaction. But when it came to presenting a section of history, that is, to making a practical application, it was a different matter, and there no error was permissible. Unfortunately, however, it happens only too often that people think they have fully understood a new theory and can apply it without more ado, from the moment they have assimilated its main principles, and even those not always correctly. And I cannot exempt many of the more recent quote unquote Marxists from this reproach. And for the most amazing rubbish has been produced in this quarter too. So I'm going to wrap up my human read stuff here. I've been reading from What is Marxism, which is by Alan Woods and Rob Sewell, and it comes from the Revolutionary Communists of America literature, teaching us about Marxism. So now I'm going to jump into my meditation, and again, I am an atheist. I am a Buddhist from the atheist perspective, so I practice Chan or Zen Buddhism, which advocates just sitting, focusing on the breath, listening, relaxing the body, focusing and relaxing the mind in alternation with the breath. All right, so we're going to move this over here, and we will be listening to Lenin while sitting to meditate. And I'll invite the cats to join me here. I have the air conditioning off, and I've been heating up the room so that when I practice yoga and martial arts in a few minutes, I'll be nice and warmed up and having a nice sweat. So right now, I'm going to put on an audiobook of Lenin while we sit to meditate, and we will continue to listen to Lenin while we practice yoga and martial arts. And I invite you to join me, because we have to make ourselves strong.
Feinberg. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is October 17, 2020, and this is an audiobook of Social Democracy's Attitude Toward the Peasant Movement by Lenin from 1905. This was originally published in Proletary number 16, September 14, 1905, published according to the text in Proletary. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 9. Translated by the late Abraham Feinberg and Julius Katzer, transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and hosted online where I got it at Marxists.org, the Marxists Internet Archive, and Lenin Internet Archive. Please go check out Marxists.org. They not only had this work, but thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other files that you can access completely for free. Running through a text reader, whatever you want to do. Every time that somebody tells me that, the idea of suggesting to read theory is like ableist or classist or whatever, I just want to scream. It's not true, and this is in fact liberal propaganda. They don't want you to read Marx, and they want to make people who tell you to actually get educated in Marxism, historical materialism, and the real struggle for socialism. Not all these anarcho whatever variants, not all these social democracy whatever, but actual Marxism. They want to make you look like a scold or, some ivory tower elitist. No, just read. People don't read enough, and the average person doesn't read a book in a year. That really needs to change. We need especially for people who already consider themselves political, already consider themselves, air quotes, left in some way. Well, do the reading and you'll be better at it. If you actually want to get somewhere. I on this channel, Socialism for All, hold that if we really get organized, agitate, educate, and organize and push, we could, from now in 2020 getting started, have a revolution by 2030. I do hold that. It is entirely possible. So let's just do it. Let's stop complaining. Let's just do it, okay? Because complaining doesn't get us anywhere. It's not fun, and it just leads to this endless cycle of having to, vent and get upset about elections or whatever. We don't need that. We need to move on. We need socialism. We need to end capitalism. Okay. So let's get into the text. This is, again, a fairly early piece from Lenin, early in the sense it was well before the Russian Revolution. This is around the same time as What Is to Be Done, which is most likely going to be the next thing that I put up on the channel. It is a much longer audiobook at like 6+ hours. Okay, let's begin. The tremendous importance of the peasant movement in the democratic revolution Russia is now passing through has been repeatedly explained in the entire social democratic press. As is well known, the Third Congress of the RSDLP passed a special resolution on this question in order to define more exactly and to coordinate the activities of the whole party of the class-conscious proletariat with regard to the peasant movement of today. Although the resolution was drawn up in advance, the first draft was published in Viperiod number 11, March of 1905, and although it was carefully gone over at the Party Congress, which took pains to formulate the views already established throughout the Russian social democratic movement, the resolution has nevertheless perplexed a number of comrades working in Russia. The Saratov Committee has unanimously declared this resolution unacceptable. It is to be regretted that an explanation of this verdict, as requested by us at this time, has not yet been forthcoming. We only know that the Saratov Committee has declared also unacceptable the agrarian resolution passed by the new Iskra Conference. Consequently, they are dissatisfied by what is common to both resolutions, not by what distinguishes them. Quick comment from S4A, where Lenin references the social democratic movement here. This is before they started calling themselves the Communist Party. So social democratic at this time is what we would think of as Marxist, socialist communist. New material on this question is provided by a letter we have received from a Moscow comrade issued in the form of a hectographed leaflet. We print this letter in full. Quote, an open letter to the Central Committee and to the comrades working in the rural districts. Comrades, the regional organization of the Moscow Committee has taken up work among the peasants. The lack of experience in organizing such work, the special conditions prevailing in the rural districts of central Russia, and also the lack of clarity in the directives contained in the resolutions of the Third Congress on this question, and the almost complete absence of material in the periodical and other press on work among the peasantry, compel us to appeal to the Central Committee to send us detailed directives covering both the theoretical aspect and the practical questions involved, while we ask comrades who are doing similar work to acquaint us with the practical knowledge your experience has given you. We consider it necessary to inform you about the misgivings that have arisen among us after reading the resolution of the Third Congress, quote, on the attitude toward the peasant movement, and about the organizational plan which we are already beginning to apply in our work in the rural districts. Quoting that resolution, quote, to carry on propaganda among the mass of the people, explaining that social democracy aims at giving the most energetic support to all revolutionary measures taken by the peasantry and likely to improve their condition, measures including confiscation of land belonging to the landlords, the state, the church, the monasteries, and the imperial family, unquote, from the resolution of the Third Congress of the RSDLP. First of all, this paragraph does not clarify how party organizations will or should carry on their propaganda. Propaganda requires, first and foremost, an organization standing very close to those who are to be propagandized. Whether this organization should consist of committees of the rural proletariat or whether other organizational forms of oral and printed propaganda are possible, this question remains unanswered. The same applies to the promise to give energetic support. To give support, and energetic support at that, is also possible only if local organizations exist. To us, the question of energetic support seems in general very vague. Can social democracy support the expropriation of landlords' estates that are farmed most intensively with the use of machinery, cultivating high-grade crops, etc.? The transfer of such estates to petty bourgeois proprietors, however important improvement of their condition may be, would be a step back from the standpoint of the capitalist development of the given estate. In our opinion, we as social democrats should have made a reservation on this matter of, quote, support, quote, provided the expropriation of this land and its transfer to peasant, petty bourgeois ownership results in a higher form of economic development on these estates, unquote. Further, quoting the resolution, to strive for the independent organization of the rural proletariat, for its fusion with the urban proletariat under the banner of the Social Democratic Party, and for the inclusion of its representatives in the peasant committees, unquote. Doubts arise with regard to the latter part of this paragraph. The fact is that bourgeois democratic organizations such as the Peasant Union and reactionary utopian organizations such as the Socialist Revolutionaries organize under their banner both bourgeois and proletarian elements of the peasantry. By bringing into such peasant committees our representatives from rural proletarian organizations, we shall be contradicting ourselves, our stand regarding a bloc, etc. Here too, we believe amendments, and very serious ones, are needed. These are a few general remarks on the resolutions of the Third Congress. These should be analyzed as soon and in as great detail as possible. As regards the plans for a, quote, rural organization in our regional organization, we must say that we have to work under conditions which are not even mentioned in the resolutions of the Third Congress. First of all, it should be noted that the territory we cover, Moscow gubernia and the adjoining uyezdz of neighboring gubernias, is mainly an industrial area with a relatively low level of handicraft industry, and with a very small section of the population engaged exclusively in agriculture. Huge textile mills, each employing 10,000 to 15,000 workers, alternate with small factories employing 500 to 1,000 workers, and scattered in out-of-the-way hamlets and villages. One would think that in such conditions, social democracy would find here a most favorable field for its activities, but facts have proved so superficial, an assumption does not hold water. Although some of the factories have been in existence for 40 or 50 years, the overwhelming majority of our proletariat have not yet become divorced from the land. The, quote, village has such a strong hold over them that none of the psychological and other characteristics acquired by a, quote, pure proletarian in the course of collective work develops among our proletarians. The farming carried on by our, quote, proletarians is of a peculiarly linsey-woolsey type. A weaver employed in a mill hires a laborer to till his patch of land. His wife, if she is not working at the mill, his children, and the aged and invalid members of the family work on the same piece of land, and he himself will work on it when he becomes old or maimed, or is discharged for violent or suspicious behavior. Such, quote, proletarians can hardly be called proletarians. Their economic status is that of paupers, their ideology is that of petty bourgeois. They are ignorant and conservative. It is from such that Black Hundred elements are recruited. However, even among these people, class consciousness has begun to awaken of late. Through the agency of, quote, pure proletarians, we are endeavoring to rouse these ignorant masses from their age-old slumber, and not without success. Our contacts are increasing in number, and in places our foothold is becoming firmer. The paupers are coming under our influence, beginning to adopt our ideology, both in the factory and in the village. And we believe that it will not be unorthodox to form organizations in an environment that is not, quote, purely proletarian. We have no other environment, and were we to insist on orthodoxy and organize only the rural proletariat, we would have to disband our organization and those in the neighboring districts. Quick comment here from S4A, where where this pamphlet is talking about the, quote, pure proletariat. Remember that the proletariat was theorized by Marx and Engels, defined as a completely dispossessed worker who really has no possessions at all and just sort of is an industrial worker who their only commodity that they have to sell is their labor. What they're talking about here with the peasants and the, quote, rural proletariat, they're putting proletariat in quotes, or pure in quotes, because they're not completely dispossessed. They have like a little farm of their own in the village, and like they will work in a factory, but they also have this little farm. They might even like hire people to work on it. So while this clearly is a destitute working class, they're about as poor as the proletariat. They're not really the proletariat as in a Marxist sense. So they're saying that if they only went with the pure proletariat in the rural regions, they wouldn't have enough people to work with. So therefore they have to organize this other class of peasants. And as they say, they're having some success doing that. Another comment, I mean, in the United States, I think you could say that there's a lot of this. People who live in a very rural area, they're not industrial workers, they maybe even own a little bit of land, but they're dirt poor. But they have a truck, or they have, a little bit of equipment, chainsaws, snowplow, something. They're not strictly proletariat, but effectively they're like half an inch away from being proletariat, and therefore communists should work with and organize these people, even though it's not in the strictest sense. Okay. Moving on back to the text. We know we shall have difficulties in struggling against the urge to expropriate the arable and other land neglected by the landlords, or those lands which the Holy Fathers in cowl and cassock have not been able to farm properly. We know that bourgeois democracy, from the, quote, democratic monarchist faction, such a faction exists in Ruza Uyezd, down to the, quote, peasant union, will fight us for influence among the paupers, but we shall arm the latter to oppose the former. Comment, in the United States, of course, many of these like country right-wingers who are poor, paupers, really should be going left, but they're told by the NRA and the Republican Party, etc., the GOP is arming them against us. It's actually the opposite of here. Of course, groups like the Socialist Rifle Organization are trying to do the opposite, but you can see, I think, similar dynamics as described here. And we shall make use of all social democratic forces in the region, both intellectual and proletarian, to set up and consolidate our social democratic committees of paupers. And we shall do this in accordance with the following plan. In each Uyezd town or big industrial center, we shall set up Uyezd committees of groups coming under the regional organization. In addition to setting up factory committees in its district, the Uyezd committee will also set up peasant committees. For reasons of secrecy, these committees should not have many people on them and should be made up of the most revolutionary and capable pauperized peasants. Wherever there are both factories and peasants, workers and peasants should be organized in a single subgroup committee. In the first place, such committees should have a clear and exact idea of local conditions. A. Agrarian relationships. 1. Peasant allotments, leases, forms of tenure, communal by households, etc. 2. The neighboring land. 2a. To whom it belongs. B. The amount of land. C. What relation the peasants have to this land. D. On what terms the land is held. 1. Labor rent. 2. Excessive rent for cut-off lands, etc. E. Indebtedness to kulaks, landlords, etc. Point B. Imposts, taxes, the rate of assessment of peasant and landlord lands respectively. C. Migratory labor and handicraft industries passports, whether there is winter hiring, etc. D. Local factories and plants, the working conditions there. 1. Wages. 2. Working hours. 3. The attitude of the management. 4. Housing conditions, etc. E. The administration, the rural superintendents, the volost headman, the clerk, the volost judges, constables, the priest. F. The zemstvo, counselors representing the peasants, zemstvo employees, the teacher, the doctor, libraries, schools, tea rooms. G. Volost assemblies, their composition and procedure. H. Organizations, the peasant union, socialist revolutionaries, social democrats. So a quick comment there again. where that section is like a list of all the different social factors. It says, in the first place, such committees, the rural committees trying to do this organizing work, should have a clear and exact idea of local conditions. That is really key. If you join the IWW and do their organizer trainings, you will be trained and will practice doing the same thing within a workplace. It's called social mapping. Who works where, who's related to whom, who carpools with whom, how long has everybody been there, who has charisma, who is shy, who's friends with the boss, who hates the boss, etc., etc., etc. They're talking about doing the same thing, but in an overall, like a county. So this is key. You know, if we want to agitate, educate, and organize, you've really got to know the ins and outs so that you can navigate them and master them. All right, back to the text. After familiarizing itself with all these data, the Peasant Social Democratic Committee is obliged to get such decisions passed by the assemblies as may be necessitated by any abnormal state of affairs. This committee should simultaneously carry on among the masses intense propaganda and agitation for the ideas of social democracy, organize study circles, impromptu meetings, mass meetings, distribute leaflets and other literature, collect funds for the party, and keep in touch with the regional organization through the Uyezid group. If we succeed in setting up a number of such committees, the success of social democracy will be assured. Regional organizer. Unquote, back to Lenin. It goes without saying that we shall not undertake the task of working out the detailed practical directives to which the comrade refers. This is a matter for the comrades on the spot and for the central body in Russia which is guiding the practical work. We propose to take the opportunity presented by our Moscow comrades' interesting letter to explain the resolution of the Third Congress and the urgent tasks of the party in general. It is obvious from the letter that the misunderstandings caused by the resolution of the Third Congress are only partly due to doubts in the field of theory. Another source is the new question, which has not arisen before, about the relations between the, quote, revolutionary peasant committees and the, quote, social democratic committees which are working among the peasants. The very posing of this question testifies to the big step forward made in social democratic work among the peasants. Questions of, relatively speaking, detail are now being brought into the foreground by the practical requirements of, quote, rural agitation, which is striking root and assuming stable and permanent forms. And the author of this letter keeps forgetting that when he blames the Congress resolution for lack of clarity, he is in fact seeking an answer to a question which the Congress of the party did not raise and could not have raised. For instance, the author is not quite right when he says that both propagation of our ideas and support for the peasant movement are possible only if local organizations exist. Of course, such organizations are desirable, and as the work increases, they will become necessary. But such work is possible and necessary even where no such organizations exist. In all our activities, even when carried on exclusively among the urban proletariat, we must never lose sight of the peasant question and must disseminate the declaration made by the entire party of the class-conscious proletariat in the person of the Third Congress, namely, that we support a peasant uprising. The peasants must learn this from literature, from the workers, from special organizations, etc. The peasants must learn that in giving this support, the social democratic proletariat will not stop short of any form of confiscation of the land, i.e. expropriation without compensation to the owners. A question of theory has, in this connection, been raised by the author of the letter, whether the expropriation of the big estates and their transfer to, quote, peasant petty bourgeois ownership should not be specifically qualified. But by proposing such a reservation, the author has arbitrarily limited the purport of the resolution of the Third Congress. There is not a word in the resolution about the Social Democratic Party undertaking to support transfer of the confiscated lands to petty bourgeois proprietors. The resolution states we support, quote, up to and including confiscation, i.e. including expropriation without compensation. However, the resolution does not in any way decide to whom the expropriated land is to be given. It was not by chance that the question was left open. It is obvious from the articles in the period numbers 11, 12, and 15 that it was deemed unwise to decide this question in advance. It was stated there, for instance, that under a democratic republic, social democracy cannot pledge itself and have its hands tied with regard to nationalization of the land. Indeed, it is the revolutionary democratic aspect of the peasant uprisings and a particular organization of the rural proletariat in a class party that, at present form, the crux of the matter for us, as distinct from the petty bourgeois socialist revolutionaries. It is not schemes of a, quote, general redistribution or nationalization that is the kernel of the question. The essential thing is that the peasantry see the need for, and accomplish, the revolutionary demolition of the old order. That is why the socialist revolutionaries are pressing for, quote, socialization, etc., while we are pressing for revolutionary peasant committees. Without the latter, we say, all reforms amount to nothing. With them and supported by them, the victory of the peasant uprising is possible. We must help the peasant uprising in every way, up to and including confiscation of the land, but certainly not including all sorts of petty bourgeois schemes. We support the peasant movement to the extent that it is revolutionary democratic. We are making ready, doing so now at once, to fight it when, and to the extent that, it becomes reactionary and anti-proletarian. The essence of Marxism lies in that double task, which only those who do not understand Marxism can vulgarize or compress into a single and simple task. Let us take a concrete instance. Let us assume that the peasant uprising has been victorious. The revolutionary peasant committees and the provisional revolutionary government, relying in part on these very committees, can proceed to any confiscation of big property. We are in favor of confiscation, as we have already declared. But to whom shall we recommend giving the confiscated land? On this question we have not committed ourselves, nor shall we ever do so, by declarations like those rashly proposed by the author of the letter. The latter has forgotten that the same resolution of the Third Congress speaks of, quote, purging the revolutionary democratic content of the peasant movement of all reactionary admixtures, unquote. That is one point. And secondly, of the need, quote, in all cases and under all circumstances for the independent organization of the rural proletariat, unquote. These are our directives. There will always be reactionary admixtures in the peasant movement, and we declare war on them in advance. Class antagonism between the rural proletariat and the peasant bourgeoisie is unavoidable, and we disclose it in advance, explain it, and prepare for the struggle on the basis of that antagonism. One of the immediate causes of such a struggle may very likely be provided by the question, to whom shall the confiscated land be given and how? We do not gloss over that question, nor do we promise equalitarian distribution, quote, socialization, etc. What we do say is that this is a question we shall fight out later on, fight again on a new field and with other allies. There, we shall certainly be with the rural proletariat, with the entire working class, against the peasant bourgeoisie. In practice, this may mean the transfer of the land to the class of petty peasant proprietors, wherever big estates based on bondage and feudal servitude still prevail, and there are as yet no material conditions for large-scale socialist production. It may mean nationalization, given complete victory of the democratic revolution, or the big capitalist estates being transferred to workers' associations. For from the democratic revolution we shall at once, and precisely in accordance with the measure of our strength, the strength of the class-conscious and organized proletariat, begin to pass to the socialist revolution. We stand for uninterrupted revolution. We shall not stop halfway. If we do not now and immediately promise all sorts of, quote, socialization, that is because we know the actual conditions for that task to be accomplished, and we do not gloss over the new class struggle burgeoning within the peasantry, but reveal that struggle. At first, we support the peasantry en masse against the landlords, supported to the hilt and with all means, including confiscation, and then, it would be better to say at the same time, we support the proletariat against the peasantry en masse. To try to calculate now what the combination of forces will be within the peasantry, quote, on the day after the revolution, the democratic revolution, is empty utopianism. Without falling into adventurism or going against our conscience in matters of science, without striving for cheap popularity, we can and do assert only one thing. We shall bend every effort to help the entire peasantry achieve the democratic revolution, in order thereby to make it easier for us, the party of the proletariat, to pass on as quickly as possible to the new and higher task, the socialist revolution. We promise no harmony, no equalitarianism or socialization following the victory of the present peasant uprising. On the contrary, we promise a new struggle, new inequality, the new revolution we are striving for. Our doctrine is less, quote, sweet than the legends of the socialist revolutionaries, but let those who want to be fed solely on sweets join the socialist revolutionaries. We shall say to such people, good riddance. In our opinion, this Marxist point of view settles also the question of the committees. In our opinion, there should be no social democratic peasant committees. If they are social democratic, that means they are not purely peasant committees. If they are peasant committees, that means they are not purely proletarian, not social democratic committees. There is a host of such who would confuse the two, but we are not of their number. Wherever possible, we shall strive to set up our committees, committees of the Social Democratic Labor Party. They will consist of peasants, paupers, intellectuals, prostitutes. A worker recently asked us in a letter why not carry on agitation among the prostitutes. Soldiers, teachers, workers, in short, all social democrats, and none but social democrats. These committees will conduct the whole of social democratic work in its full scope, striving, however, to organize the rural proletariat especially and particularly, since the Social Democratic Party is the class party of the proletariat. To consider it unorthodox to organize a proletariat which has not entirely freed itself from various relics of the past is a tremendous delusion, and we would like to think that the relevant passages of the letter are due to a mere misunderstanding. The urban and industrial proletariat will inevitably be the nucleus of our Social Democratic Labor Party, but we must attract to it, enlighten, and organize all who labor and are exploited, as stated in our program, all without exception, handicraftsmen, paupers, beggars, servants, tramps, prostitutes, of course, subject to the necessary and obligatory condition that they join the social democratic movement and not that the social democratic movement join them, that they adopt the standpoint of the proletariat and not that the proletariat adopt theirs. The reader may ask, what is the point then of having revolutionary peasant committees? Does this mean that they are not necessary? No, they are necessary. Our ideal is purely social democratic committees in all its rural districts, and then agreement between them and all revolutionary democratic elements, groups, and circles of the peasantry for the purpose of establishing revolutionary committees. There is a perfect analogy here to the independence of the Social Democratic Labor Party in the towns and its alliance with all the revolutionary Democrats for the purpose of insurrection. We are in favor of a peasant uprising. We are absolutely opposed to the mixing and merging of heterogeneous class elements and heterogeneous parties. We hold that for the purpose of insurrection, social democracy should give an impetus to all revolutionary democracy, should help it all to organize, should march shoulder to shoulder with it, but without merging with it, to the barricades in the cities and against the landlords and the police in the villages. Long live the insurrection in town and country against the autocracy. Long live revolutionary social democracy, the vanguard of all revolutionary democracy in the present revolution. Okay, that's the end of the audiobook. So there you go. There are a few notes at the end. There's really just one: winter hiring, that was mentioned earlier on. The hiring of peasants for summer work practiced by the landlords and kulaks during the winter when the peasants were particularly in need of cash and would agree to extortionate terms. So that was what did they call that? Prejudicial contract? I can't remember the term for it. Anyway, it's a kind of practice where the terms are just basically you're held at gunpoint to agree to a horrible situation, basically with implied coercion. Okay. And I'm sure that kind of thing, well, it still exists among undocumented workers who are, not that exact scenario, but extortionate terms for sure. Undocumented migrant workers, and also, travel to the very rural areas of the United States, Montana, Idaho, rural Washington, New Hampshire, Maine, out there on the fringes. These places are, Vermont, upstate New York, there's a lot of weird shit that goes on in these places that is very sketchy, very air quotes unprofessional, and in some ways resembles feudalism almost more than it does capitalism, in terms of like kind of bondage, being above and beyond even what the proletariat experiences. Okay, so I think this is an interesting piece. I liked honestly the pamphlet. I think that Lenin quoted in full an open letter to the Central Committee and to the comrades working in the rural districts. I think that's an interesting sort of boots on the ground interpretation of like what they're encountering out there, and then Lenin, I think not overly critically, is helping to correct and hammer out some of the points. Of course, this was in 1905. The successful revolution was not till 1917, and then there was a 5-year civil war following that. So obviously, in the interim, they did figure out the peasant question and how to do it, and we'll be covering many of the in-between pieces here on the channel with time. But I guess my point is these are not easy questions. Trying to have a revolution in a country that isn't entirely industrialized. You look at the United States now; it's being de-industrialized. We have a service economy on the one hand, of gentrified little coffee shops that charge $6 or $7 a cup because that's the only way you can stay in business, and the people who work at those. And then, it's a precarious existence. Those shops are in and out of existence in a matter of years. And the people who work in them are in and out of the jobs in a matter of months. This is, hardly the age of the factory town and that sort of stable organizing scenario, which had its own challenges because, it was almost like a more feudal mindset, this like local bourgeois nobility, air quotes. There's definitely in some of the rural regions of the United States still that kind of mentality of like the capitalists are betters, and the preachers who are in bed with the capitalists are betters, and we're their flock and all this kind of crap. This is why, we could probably never be opposed to religion on a policy basis, but I personally think socialists, Marxists should do everything we can to expose that kind of religious organizing. I mean, religion in general has not, on the whole, been super kind to communists over the years, even before, Stalin-era policies, maybe in the USSR. The Catholic Church was always opposed to socialism, etc. They set up their alternatives to it. But yeah, we don't live in a place, you look at, for example, the major cities. This is something conservatives complain about a lot in the United States. Major cities, they say we need the Electoral College because otherwise, New York City and Los Angeles and a couple of other cities, which all vote Democratic, would decide the election. Well, yeah, that's because they have a more advanced socialist, progressive, whatever attitude. Not that the Democratic Party leadership, which is controlled by the 1%, tends to share those, but they're definitely not Republicans, is the point. The Republicans who are openly, antagonistic. Democrats have only more recently become that openly antagonistic to more progressive policies, at least proving it, doubling down time and time again. I mean, they always have been, but they're making such a very public display of it now. Anyway, you get my point. The cities are more liberal, is my point. And, the rural areas are not. They are getting picked off ideologically by the bourgeoisie, who are turning those people into weapons for reaction, weapons for fascism. And the people getting turned are not benefiting at all from that arrangement. I mean, all they get is this modest sense of pride that they're, on the winning side or whatever the fuck. What's my point? The peasant question is a hard question. It was hard to deal with in Russia. It's hard to deal with in the United States. The Democratic Party obviously is openly alienating towards the more, quote, backward regions, and they're not doing anything. Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment. Even if part of that's true, it's not a way to win people over. You need a different system of, just PR and communications to go about it. It's encouraging to see things like Redneck Revolt and other organizations which are on a cultural level trying to redefine what it means to be country, and that means having a socialist outlook and not being a tool of the capitalists who are setting up the fracking and poisoning your family and putting you out of work and cutting your education and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm rambling, so on that note, I'm going to call off the commentary. Leave me a comment. What do you think? And was this interesting, and everything else? And yeah, thanks to our current patrons whose names are on the screen. You can support Socialism for All at patreon.com/Socialism for All for as little as $2 a month or as many as $200 a month. Every last one of these contributions is encouraging to me. Of course, the more actual money I get, the more time I can spend on this. So give what you can. Obviously, we live in very trying times. But your subscriptions, comments, sharing the video in your Facebook groups, Discord servers, Reddit subs, whatever you do, that is very helpful as well. You can follow us at facebook.com/socialism for all. Also, facebook.com/socialism, the number 4 all, which I set up as a backup because Facebook's throttling the main page hard. Thank you. And for Revolution 2030, let's get our shit together. See you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Socialism and Anarchism from 1905 by Vladimir Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So the last video that we put up on the channel was the similarly titled Anarchism and Socialism by Lenin from 1901. That is kind of a cursory document. It looks like a draft of notes that Lenin started. They're not as well fleshed out. This document, I feel like Lenin pulled out the old notes and fleshed them out in a particular situation, which was the denial of credentials to the anarchists in the newly formed Soviets after the 1905 First Russian Revolution, which didn't take power, but they established the first Soviets after that, and they started building power towards the 1917 Russian Revolution. So this was written on November 24, 1905, published in Novaya Jin, number 21, November 25, 1905, signed in Lenin, and published according to the newspaper text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1965, Moscow, Volume 10. Transcription and HTML markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Marxists Internet Archive, thanks as usual to marxists.org. So before we get into the text, remember again, 1905, this was after the First Russian Revolution and the establishment of the first Soviets. Lenin, in this document, discusses the Soviets and their role and whether or not anarchists were welcome in them and why or why not. So here's the text. The Executive Committee of the Soviet of Workers' Deputies decided yesterday, November 23rd, to reject the application of the anarchists for representation on the Executive Committee and on the Soviet of Workers' Deputies. The Executive Committee itself has given the following reasons for this decision. Quote, 1. In the whole of international practice, congresses and socialist conferences have never included representatives of the anarchists, since they do not recognize the political struggle as a means for the achievement of their ideals. 2. Only parties can be represented, and the anarchists are not a party, unquote. We consider the decision of the Executive Committee to be in the highest degree correct, and of enormous importance from the point of view both of principle and of practical politics. If we were to regard the Soviet of Workers' Deputies as a workers' parliament, or as an organ of proletarian self-government, then of course it would have been wrong to reject the application of the anarchists. However insignificant, fortunately, the influence of the anarchists among our workers may be, nevertheless, a certain number of workers undoubtedly support them. The question whether the anarchists constitute a party, an organization, a group, or a voluntary association of like-minded people, is a formal question and not of major importance in terms of principle. Lastly, if the anarchists, while rejecting the political struggle, apply for representation in an institution which is conducting such a struggle, this crying inconsistency merely goes to show once again how utterly unstable are the philosophy and tactics of the anarchists. But of course, instability is no reason for excluding anyone from a parliament or an organ of self-government. We regard the decision of the Executive Committee as absolutely correct, and in no way contradicting the functions, the character, and the composition of this body. The Soviet of Workers' Deputies is not a labor parliament, and not an organ of proletarian self-government, nor an organ of self-government at all, but a fighting organization for the achievement of definite aims. This fighting organization includes, on the basis of a temporary, unwritten fighting agreement, representatives of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the Party of Proletarian Socialism, of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the representatives of petty bourgeois socialism, or the extreme left wing of revolutionary bourgeois Democrats, and finally, many non-party workers. Just a quick comment there. We have seen these factions mentioned before in previous Lenin writings that we've done on the channel. So the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, this was the party that had the Menshevik faction and the Bolshevik faction, and later split. The Bolsheviks took power in 1917. The Mensheviks were basically social democrats by today's standards. So in terms of the way that they behaved and the things that they believed, think of what we do on the channel with the Hanging with the Sockdem gang, Kyle Kalinske, Humanist Report, people like that. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, the representatives of petty bourgeois socialism, as Lenin calls them. These to me sound more like the kind of bread tube radlibs who aren't a lot of times explicitly anarchist, but just kind of radical liberals. It's a hard thing to pin down. You could call them the non-revolutionary left, or in this case, Lenin was talking about the extreme left wing of revolutionary bourgeois Democrats. What does that mean? Well, Russia at this time was still a monarchy. They had capitalist elements running, but it was still governed by the Tsar. He wasn't deposed until 1917, and then there was a power vacuum for most of that year while these different factions fought over who was going to take power, and eventually the Bolsheviks won, thankfully, because the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, the Sockdems and Radlibs of their day, sided with the Cadet Party, which was the bourgeois party, which wanted to say, okay, we got rid of the Tsar, now we're going to just run Russia like any capitalist country and just have a bourgeois party. So when push came to shove, that's who they sided with. So Lenin is completely correct in referring to them as the extreme left wing of revolutionary, anti-monarchist, in other words, bourgeois Democrats. All right, hope that's clear. It's a lot to sort out, although on repeated passes with this material, you can kind of get it. Anyway, back to the anarchists. So the latter, however, non-party workers, are not non-party in general, but are non-party revolutionaries. Their sympathies being entirely on the side of the revolution, workers' revolution, for the victory of which they are fighting with boundless enthusiasm, energy, and self-sacrifice. For that reason, it will be quite natural to include representatives of the revolutionary peasantry in the Executive Committee. For all practical purposes, the Soviet of Workers' Deputies is an inchoate, broad fighting alliance of socialists and revolutionary Democrats. The term non-party revolutionary, of course, representing a series of transitional stages between the former and the latter. Such an alliance is obviously necessary for the purpose of conducting political strikes and other more active forms of struggle for the urgent democratic demands which have been accepted and approved by the overwhelming majority of the population. Comment, meaning it is necessary because to do things like strikes and those forms of struggle, you need lots and lots of people. It's a numbers game. However, continuing, in an alliance of this sort, the anarchists will not be an asset, but a liability. They will merely bring disorganization and thus weaken the force of the joint assault. To them, it is still debatable whether political reform is urgent and important. The exclusion of anarchists from the fighting alliance, which is carrying out, as it were, our democratic revolution, is quite necessary from the point of view of this revolution and is in its interests. There can be a place in a fighting alliance only for those who fight for the aim of that alliance. If, for example, the Cadets or the Party of Law and Order, comment the more conservative party, had managed to recruit at least several hundred workers into their St. Petersburg branches, the Executive Committee of the Soviet of Workers' Deputies would hardly have opened its doors to the representatives of such organizations. Comment, such organizations, meaning ones who are bourgeois in nature and not fighting for the aim of the alliance, workers' revolution. Continuing. In explaining its decision, the Executive Committee refers to the practice of international socialist congresses. We warmly welcome this statement. This recognition by the executive body of the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies of the ideological leadership of the international social democratic movement. The Russian Revolution has already acquired international significance. The enemies of the revolution in Russia are already conspiring with Wilhelm II and with all sorts of reactionaries, tyrants, militarists, and exploiters in Europe against free Russia. Neither shall we forget that the complete victory of our revolution demands an alliance of the revolutionary proletariat of Russia with the socialist workers of all countries. It is not for nothing that the international socialist congresses adopted the decision not to admit the anarchists. A wide gulf separates socialism from anarchism, and it is in vain that the agents provocateurs of the secret police and the newspaper lackeys of reactionary governments pretend that this gulf does not exist. That, I think, still has implications to this day. Continuing. The philosophy of the anarchists is bourgeois philosophy turned inside out. Their individualistic theories and their individualistic ideal are the very opposite of socialism. Their views express not the future of bourgeois society, which is striding with irresistible force toward the socialization of labor, but the present and even the past of that society, the domination of blind chance over the scattered and isolated small producer. Their tactics, which amount to a repudiation of the political struggle, disunite the proletarians and convert them, in fact, into passive participators in one bourgeois policy or another, since it is impossible and unrealizable for the workers really to dissociate themselves from politics. In the present Russian Revolution, the task of rallying the forces of the proletariat, of organizing it, of politically educating and training the working class is more imperative than ever. The more outrageous the conduct of the Black Hundreds government, the more zealously its agents provocateurs strive to fan base passions among the ignorant masses, and the more desperately the defenders of the autocracy, which is rotting alive, clutch at every opportunity to discredit the revolution by organizing holdups, pogroms, and assassinations, and by fuddling lumpen proletarians with drink. The more important is the task of organization that falls primarily to the party of the socialist proletariat. And we shall therefore resort to every means of ideological struggle to keep the influence of the anarchists over the Russian workers just as negligible as it has been so far. That's the end of the audiobook. I hope that you have found this interesting and useful in helping to unpack some of what is going on in worker struggles today in the United States and beyond. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2. All of those contributions are very encouraging. They're also materially very supportive, and I thank all of you for that. If you can't make a financial contribution, very understandable, and other ways to support the channel are liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Don't cost you a thing, just a little bit of your time. We appreciate it. It helps to get this channel in front of more people's eyeballs and to expand this conversation. Anywhere you can share it on Facebook is particularly appreciated, since S4A has been banned from Facebook several times. Just don't get banned yourself. We appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Petty Bourgeois and Proletarian Socialism by Lenin from 1905. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Proletary number 24, November 7, 1905, the year of the First Russian Revolution. Published according to the text in Proletary as verified against the manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 9, pages 438 to 446. Translated by the late Abraham Feinberg and Julius Kotzer. Transcription by the Workers' Web ASCII Pamphlet Project. HTML markup by B. Baggins and D. Walters. And it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. They host thousands of free Marxist texts, including this one. So before we begin the audiobook, I just want to briefly comment. If you're familiar with the Manifesto of the Communist Party, or the Communist Manifesto, you'll know that Marx and Engels talked in that about different types of socialism. Feudal socialism, which is a reactionary kind of socialism which criticizes capitalism, not so much for creating a proletariat, but a revolutionary proletariat, potentially upsetting the whole apple cart. Marx and Engels also note, quote, as the parson has ever gone hand in hand with the landlord, so has clerical socialism with feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. The quote continues with, Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart burnings of the aristocrat. They also talk about petty bourgeois socialism, which they also categorize as reactionary, in that basically it wants to turn back the wheel of history and reestablish outdated modes of production. Quote, ultimately, when stubborn historical facts have dispersed all intoxicating effects of self-deception, this petty bourgeois form of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues. And specifically, what classes are we talking about here? Well, Marx and Engels say the feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie and incoming capitalism. The medieval burgesses and the small peasant proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which, as of the 1840s when this was written, are but little developed industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of competition. In other words, their small businesses are ruined and they have to take a job as a wage worker. And as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. So basically, when we talk about the petty bourgeoisie today, we're talking about, well, the name means little capitalists, so small business owners, people living that American dream of starting your own business and then trying to build it into a thriving empire that eventually you can just live off the capital one day and become a member of the big bourgeoisie. That would be the dream. The reality is that most of these people's businesses never really get off the ground. They fail. They either start a new one if they have money left over, or they just rejoin the proletariat. Very few of them actually make it, across that middle ground into the big bourgeoisie where they can just live off of the capital. And I did say rejoin the proletariat. Not all of them started out as proletarians. Some of them come from backgrounds which are non-proletarian. Whatever the case, for a long time, this was the American dream that the USA held out. Was basically anybody can become rich if you just work hard enough, open a business, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, of course, there are many barriers to actually being able to start the business, let alone most of the businesses that get started fail. So, this was one facet of the large middle class that was sort of the basis of the class peace and a lot of the buy-in that US capitalists got from the rest of the public during the 20th century USA, at least the middle part of it. But, in the 90s and 2000s, people would talk about Walmart setting up and wiping out Main Street. And then in the 2010s up to now, Amazon wiping out pretty much everything else. Some people call this the retail apocalypse. And, the petty bourgeoisie, a lot of them were small shopkeepers. It was relatively easy to set up some kind of a retail outlet. But as the retail has been consolidated and eventually moved online, and They're just doing it out of warehouses now through the mail. The ground has certainly shrunk underneath the petty bourgeoisie's feet. Some of the older ones were able to retire sort of in time, and a lot of the younger ones have had to join the proletariat, just getting a regular job for wages or salary. So kind of the second category of people who may be referred to as petty bourgeois are people who are involved in management or administration. That is, people who don't own a business, but they do have control over production in a managerial role. They are part of the working class because their livelihood depends on the capitalist keeping them on the payroll. They need that job for wages or salary. However, they are not a mere proletarian due to that control that they have, however slight, over production. They are working class, but their consciousness is going to be different because of that. So the term can refer to different types of individuals with different sort of class trajectories, although their immediate class interests and or immediate class consciousness may be similar or identical. Where they've been, what their class history is, if you will, whether they spent most of their working life in the proletariat, or if they come from more of like a petty bourgeois background and intend to do that forever and expect that may influence their perception of their future class interests, which can also be a factor in their politics. So Marx and Engels go on to describe other types of reactionary socialism: German or, quote, true socialism, conservative or bourgeois socialism, which is not, quote, socialism for the rich, as I saw somebody trying to argue on social media recently. When people say capitalism is socialism for the rich or something like that, yeah, that just means that the rich do well in capitalism. It's kind of a half-assed way of saying that. Bourgeois socialism is not that. It's trying to create a kind of capitalism that basically doesn't have any contradictions or downsides, particularly a revolutionary proletariat. So they go on: critical utopian socialism and communism, and then they finally explain their own position in relationship to the other sort of quasi-socialist parties, etc. So having refreshed our memory on that a little bit, and if you haven't read that before, please go check it out now. Let's now see what Lenin has to say in 1905 to perhaps expand on these concepts. Of the various socialist doctrines, Marxism is now predominant in Europe, the struggle for the achievement of a socialist order being almost entirely waged as a struggle of the working class under the guidance of the social democratic parties. This complete predominance of proletarian socialism, grounded in the teachings of Marxism, was not achieved all at once, but only after a long struggle against all sorts of outworn doctrines, petty bourgeois socialism, anarchism, and so on. Some 30 years ago, Marxism was not predominant even in Germany, where the prevailing views of the time were in fact transitional, mixed, and eclectic, lying between petty bourgeois and proletarian socialism. The most widespread doctrines among advanced workers in the Romance countries, in France, Spain, and Belgium, were Proudhonism, Blanchism, and anarchism, which obviously expressed the viewpoint of the petty bourgeois, not of the proletarian. What has been the cause of this rapid and complete victory of Marxism during the last decades? The correctness of the Marxist views has been confirmed to an ever greater extent by all the development of contemporary societies, both politically and economically, and by the whole experience of the revolutionary movement and of the struggle of the oppressed classes. The decline of the petty bourgeoisie inevitably led, sooner or later, to the extinction of all kinds of petty bourgeois prejudices, while the growth of capitalism and the intensification of the class struggle within capitalist society were the best agitation for the ideas of proletarian socialism. Russia's backwardness naturally accounts for the firm footing that various obsolete socialist doctrines gained in our country. The entire history of Russian revolutionary thought during the last quarter of a century is the history of the struggle waged by Marxism against petty bourgeois narodnik socialism. Quick comment: these were the populists, the narodniki. If you want to hear more about what Lenin thought about them, the original populists, and then the next-gen populists who are called the Socialist Revolutionary Party, check out 2 videos on Socialism for All: What Did Lenin Think of Populism, Parts 1 and Part 2. Short version: he was not a big fan. In fact, said we need to declare war against it. Continuing. While the rapid growth and remarkable successes of the Russian working class movement have already brought victory to Marxism in Russia too, development of an indubitably revolutionary peasant movement, especially after the famous peasant revolts in the Ukraine in 1902, has on the other hand caused a certain revival of senile narodism. The Narodnik theories of old, embellished with modish European opportunism, revisionism, Bernsteinism, and criticism of Marx, make up all the original ideological stock and trade of the so-called socialist revolutionaries. That is why the peasant question is focal in the Marxist controversies with both the pure Narodniks and the socialist revolutionaries. To a certain extent, Narodism was an integral and consistent doctrine. It denied the domination of capitalism in Russia. It denied the factory workers' role as the frontline fighters of the entire proletariat. It denied the importance of a political revolution and bourgeois political liberty. It preached an immediate socialist revolution stemming from the peasant commune with its petty forms of husbandry. All that now survives of this integral theory is mere shreds, but to understand the controversies of the present day intelligently, and to prevent these controversies from degenerating into mere squabbles, one should always remember the general and basic Narodnik roots of the errors of our socialist revolutionaries. Comment, again, this is the Socialist Revolutionary Party. I mean, you could say that Marxists are, generally speaking, socialist revolutionaries. In this case, Lenin is referring specifically to the SR Party, which was distinct from the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Continuing. The Narodniks considered the muzhik, the man of the future, in Russia, this view springing inevitably from their faith in the socialist character of the peasant commune, and from their lack of faith in the future of capitalism. Comment. Basically, these populists considered that capitalism was some kind of a deviation from the agrarian paradise that they were living in, and that they could just sort of throw off capitalism and go back to what they were doing. Continuing. The Marxists, however, considered the worker the man of the future in Russia, and the development of Russian capitalism in both agriculture and industry is providing more and more confirmation of their views. The working class movement in Russia has won recognition for itself, but as for the peasant movement, the gulf separating Narodism and Marxism is to this day revealed in their different interpretations of this movement. To the Narodniks, the peasant movement provides a refutation of Marxism. It is a movement that stands for a direct socialist revolution, does not recognize bourgeois political liberty, it stems from small-scale, not large-scale production. In a word, to the Narodnik, it is the peasant movement that is the genuine, truly socialist, and immediately socialist movement. The Narodnik faith in the peasant commune and the Narodnik branch of anarchism fully explain why such conclusions are inevitable. To the Marxist, the peasant movement is a democratic, not a socialist movement. In Russia, just as was the case in other countries, it is a necessary concomitant of the democratic revolution, which is bourgeois in its social and economic content. It is not in the least directed against the foundations of the bourgeois order, against commodity production, or against capital. On the contrary, it's directed against the old, serf, pre-capitalist relationships in the rural districts, and against landlordism, which is the mainstay of all the survivals of serf ownership. Consequently, full victory of this peasant movement will not abolish capitalism. On the contrary, it will create a broader foundation for its development, and will hasten and intensify purely capitalist development. Full victory of the peasant uprising can only create a stronghold for a democratic bourgeois republic, within which a proletarian struggle against the bourgeoisie will for the first time develop in its purest form. These, then, are the two contrasting views which must be clearly understood by anyone who wishes to examine the gulf in principles that lies between the socialist revolutionaries and the social democrats. According to one view, the peasant movement is socialist, while according to the other, it is a democratic bourgeois movement. Hence one can see what ignorance our socialist revolutionaries reveal when they repeat for the 100th time, see, for example, Revolutionная Russia, number 75, that orthodox Marxists have ignored the peasant question. There is only one way of combating such crass ignorance, that is by repeating the ABC, by setting forth the old consistently Narodnik views, and by pointing out for the 100th or the 1000th time that the real distinction between us does not lie in a desire or the non-desire to reckon with the peasant question, recognition or non-recognition of it, but in our different appraisals of the present-day peasant movement, and of the present-day peasant question in Russia. He who says that the Marxists ignore the peasant question in Russia is in the first place an absolute ignoramus, since all the principal writings of Russian Marxists, beginning with Plekhanov's Our Differences, which appeared over 20 years ago, have in the main been devoted to explaining the erroneousness of the Narodnik views on the Russian peasant question. Secondly, he who says that the Marxists ignore the peasant question thereby proves his desire to avoid giving a complete appraisal of the actual difference in principles, giving the answer to the question whether or not the present-day peasant movement is democratic bourgeois, whether or not it is objectively directed against the survivals of serfdom. The socialist revolutionaries have never given, nor will they ever be able to give, a clear and precise answer to this question, for they are floundering hopelessly between the old Narodnik view and the present-day Marxist view on the peasant question in Russia. The Marxists say that the socialist revolutionaries represent the standpoint of the petty bourgeoisie, in other words, are ideologists of petty bourgeoisie, for the very reason that they cannot rid themselves of petty bourgeois illusions and of the Narodnik imaginings in appraising the peasant movement. That is why we have to go over the ABC once again. What is the present-day peasant movement in Russia striving for? For land and liberty. What significance will the complete victory of this movement have? After winning liberty, it will abolish the rule of the landlords and bureaucrats in the administration of the state. After securing the land, it will give the landlords' estates to the peasants. Will the fullest liberty and expropriation of the landlords do away with commodity production? No, it will not. Will the fullest liberty and expropriation of the landlords abolish individual farming by peasant households on communal or, quote, socialized land? No, it will not. Will the fullest liberty and expropriation of the landlords bridge the deep gulf that separates the rich peasant, with his numerous horses and cows, from the farmhand, the day laborer, i.e. the gulf that separates the peasant bourgeoisie from the rural proletariat? No, it will not. On the contrary, the more completely the highest social estate, the landlords, is routed and annihilated, the more profound will the class distinction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat be. What will be the objective significance of the complete victory of the peasant uprising? This victory will do away with all survivals of serfdom, but it will by no means destroy the bourgeois economic system, or destroy capitalism, or the division of society into classes, into rich and poor, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Why is the present-day peasant movement a democratic bourgeois movement? Because, after destroying the power of the bureaucracy and the landlords, it will set up a democratic system of society, without, however, altering the bourgeois foundation of that democratic society, without abolishing the rule of capital. How should the class-conscious worker, the socialist, regard the present-day peasant movement? He must support this movement, help the peasants in the most energetic fashion, help them throw off completely both the rule of the bureaucracy and that of the landlords. At the same time, however, he should explain to the peasants that it is not enough to overthrow the rule of the bureaucracy and the landlords. When they overthrow that rule, they must at the same time prepare for the abolition of the rule of capital, the rule of the bourgeoisie, and for that purpose, a doctrine that is fully socialist, i.e. Marxist, should be immediately disseminated. The rural proletarians should be united, welded together, and organized for the struggle against the peasant bourgeoisie and the entire Russian bourgeoisie. Can a class-conscious worker forget the democratic struggle for the sake of the socialist struggle, or forget the latter for the sake of the former? No, a class-conscious worker calls himself a social democrat, comment in those days that just meant Marxist, for the reason that he understands the relation between the two struggles. He knows that there is no other road to socialism save the road through democracy, through political liberty. He therefore strives to achieve democratism completely and consistently in order to attain the ultimate goal, socialism. Why are the conditions for the democratic struggle not the same as those for the socialist struggle? Because the workers will certainly have different allies in each of those two struggles. The democratic struggle is waged by the workers together with a section of the bourgeoisie, especially the petty bourgeoisie. On the other hand, the socialist struggle is waged by the workers against the whole of the bourgeoisie. The struggle against the bureaucrat and the landlord can and must be waged together with all the peasants, even the well-to-do and the middle peasants. On the other hand, it is only together with the rural proletariat that the struggle against the bourgeoisie, and therefore against the well-to-do peasants too, can be properly waged. If we keep in mind all these elementary Marxist truths, which the socialist revolutionaries always prefer to avoid going into, we shall have no difficulty in appraising the latter's, quote, latest objections to Marxism, such as the following. Quote, why was it necessary? Revolutionaria Rossia number 75 exclaims, quote, first to support the peasant in general against the landlord, and then, i.e. at the same time, to support the proletariat against the peasant in general, instead of at once supporting the proletariat against the landlord, and what Marxism has to do with this, heaven alone knows, unquote. This is the standpoint of the most primitive, childishly naive anarchism. For many centuries, and even for thousands of years, humanity has dreamt of doing away, quote, at once, with all and every kind of exploitation. These dreams remained mere dreams until millions of the exploited all over the world began to unite for a consistent, staunch, and comprehensive struggle to change capitalist society in the direction the evolution of that society is naturally taking. Socialist dreams turned into the socialist struggle of the millions only when Marx's scientific socialism had linked up the urge for change with the struggle of a definite class. Outside the class struggle, socialism is either a hollow phrase or a naive dream. In Russia, however, two different struggles of two different social forces are taking place before our very eyes. The proletariat is fighting against the bourgeoisie wherever capitalist relations of production exist, and they exist, be it known to our socialist revolutionaries, even in the peasant commune, i.e. on the land which from their standpoint is 100% quote socialized. As a stratum of small landowners, of petty bourgeois, the peasantry is fighting against all survivals of serfdom, against the bureaucrats and the landlords. Only those who are completely ignorant of political economy and of the history of revolutions throughout the world can fail to see that these are two distinct and different social wars. To shut one's eyes to the diversity of these wars by demanding, quote, at once, is like hiding one's head under one's wing and refusing to make any analysis of reality. The socialist revolutionaries, who have lost the integrity of the old Narodnik views, have even forgotten many of the teachings of the Narodniks themselves. As the selfsame Revolutionaria Rossia writes in the same article, quote, by helping the peasantry to expropriate the landlords, Mr. Lenin is unconsciously assisting in building up petty bourgeois economy on the ruins of the more or less developed forms of capitalist agriculture. Is this not a step backward from the standpoint of orthodox Marxism, unquote? For shame, gentlemen, why, you've forgotten your own Mr. V.V. Consult his Destiny of Capitalism, the sketches by Mr. Nikolai Ahn, and other sources of your wisdom. Footnote there, V.V. was a pseudonym of V. Vorontsov, author of the book The Destiny of Capitalism in Russia. Nikolai Ahn was a pseudonym of N. Danielson, author of the book Sketches on Our Post-Reform Social Economy. Both men were ideologists of liberal narratism of the 1880s and 1890s. Back to the text. You will then recollect that landlord farming in Russia combines within itself features both of capitalism and of serf ownership. You will then find out that there is a system of economy based on labor rent, which is a direct survival of the corvée system. If, moreover, you take the trouble to consult such an orthodox Marxist book as the third volume of Marx's Capital, you will find that nowhere could the corvée system develop, and nowhere did it develop, and turn into capitalist farming except through the medium of petty bourgeois peasant farming. In your efforts to scatter Marxism to the winds, you resort to methods too primitive, methods too long ago exposed. You ascribe to Marxism a grotesquely oversimplified conception of large-scale capitalist farming, directly succeeding to large-scale farming based on the corvée system. You argue that since the yield on the landlord's estates is higher than on the peasant farms, the expropriation of the landlords is a step backward. This argument is worthy of a fourth-form schoolboy. Just consider, gentlemen, was it not a step backward to separate the low-yielding peasant lands from the high-yielding landlord's estates when serfdom was abolished? Present-day landlord economy in Russia combines features of both capitalism and serf ownership. Objectively, the peasant struggle against the landlords today is a struggle against survivals of serfdom. However, to attempt to enumerate all individual cases, to weigh each individual case, and to determine with the precision of an apothecary's scales exactly where serf ownership ends and pure capitalism begins, is to ascribe one's own pedantry to the Marxists. We cannot calculate what portion of the price of provisions bought from a petty shopkeeper represents labor value and what part of it represents swindling, etc. Does that mean, gentlemen, that we must discard the theory of labor value? Contemporary landlord economy combines features of both capitalism and serfdom, but only pedants can conclude from this that it is our duty to weigh, count, and copy out every minute feature in every particular instance, and pigeonhole it in this or that social category. Only utopians can hence conclude that there is no need for us to draw a distinction between the two different social wars. Indeed, the only actual conclusion that does follow is that both in our program and in our tactics, we must combine the purely proletarian struggle against capitalism with the general democratic and general peasant struggle against serfdom. The more marked the capitalist features in present-day landlord semi-feudal economy, the more imperative it is to get right down to organizing the rural proletariat separately. For this will help the purely capitalist or purely proletarian antagonisms to assert themselves the sooner, whenever confiscation takes place. The more marked the capitalist features in landlord economy, the sooner will democratic confiscation give an impetus to the real struggle for socialism. And consequently, the more dangerous is false idealization of the democratic revolution through use of the catchword of socialization. Such is the conclusion to be drawn from the fact that landlord economy is a mixture of capitalism and serf ownership relations. Thus, we must combine the purely proletarian struggle with the general peasant struggle, but not confuse the two. We must support the general democratic and general peasant struggle, but not become submerged in this non-class struggle. We must never idealize it with false catchwords such as socialization, or ever forget the necessity of organizing both the urban and the rural proletariat in an entirely independent class party of social democracy. While giving the utmost support to the most determined democratism, that party will not allow itself to be diverted from the revolutionary path by reactionary dreams and experiments in equalization under the system of commodity production. The peasant struggle against the landlords is now a revolutionary struggle. The confiscation of the landlords' estates at the present stage of economic and political evolution is revolutionary in every respect, and we back this revolutionary democratic measure. However, to call this measure socialization and to deceive oneself and the people concerning the possibility of equality in land tenure under the system of commodity production is a reactionary, petty bourgeois utopia, which we leave to the socialist revolutionaries. That is the end of the audiobook. So I don't really have further comments. I think Lenin kind of beat this one to death. So what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, and they've allowed me to produce a lot more content for the channel than I would have been able to do without that support. Thanks again. Also, after the content has been produced and uploaded, engagement counts. So like, share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of it helps YouTube to recommend this content to new people, gets it in front of more eyeballs, and keeps expanding the audience. Capitalism is in serious crisis. We need to improve the quality of the left, get more people engaged in understanding this kind of history and theory, so that the struggle against capitalism can take on better and more productive forms with fewer mistakes. Along those lines, join an organization if there's a good one at all in your area, whether you're in a city or a rural area. The organizations tend to be more pronounced in the urban areas just because more people live there. So there are greater odds of getting people together, but if you're in an area where there aren't orgs or aren't good orgs, try to find a good org and at least join at the national level, and then see if you can participate in some way until there are more people in your area, or until you live in a different area where there are more people to join up with. All right, thanks again, and we'll catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of Revolutionary Struggle and Liberal Brokerage by Lenin, 1905. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published first in Proletarian number 3, June 9, 1905, published according to the text in Proletary and checked with the manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Foreign Languages Publishing House, 1962, Moscow, Volume 8. Translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Isidore Lasker. HTML transcription and markup by Arsen Bala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So for historical context, 1905 was the year of the First Russian Revolution. This was a major uprising against Tsarism, and the uprising included the bourgeoisie, who had not yet overthrown Tsarism, feudalism, in Russia at that point. As a result of the 1905 uprisings, a number of reforms were won. The bourgeoisie then considered themselves to be next in line to inherit power and set up capitalism and extend it fully. However, because of all of the socialist organizing, especially in the context of World War I, 1914 to 1918, the socialists were able to basically overthrow the new bourgeois government pretty much as soon as it was set up in 1917. That provisional government didn't last even an entire year before it was overthrown. But anyway, we go back now to 1905 and less than half a year after that first uprising, so here we go. The rise of political parties is one of the most interesting and characteristic features of our interesting epoch. The old order, the autocracy, is falling to pieces. Increasing sections, not only of so-called society, i.e. the bourgeoisie, but also of the people, i.e. the working class and the peasantry, have begun to reflect on the kind of new order that has to be built, and on the way to build it. For the class-conscious proletariat, these attempts of the various classes to frame a program and organize the political struggle are of momentous importance. Although these attempts largely originate from individual figures responsible to no one and leading no one, and are therefore often fortuitous, arbitrary, and at times bombastic, the basic interests and tendencies of the big social classes, broadly speaking, assert themselves with irresistible force. Out of the seeming chaos of declarations, demands, and platforms, there clearly emerged the political physiognomy of our bourgeoisie and its real, not only specious, political program. The proletariat is obtaining increasingly more material by which to judge how the Russian bourgeoisie, which now talks of political action, is really going to act, what stand it will take in the decisive revolutionary struggle towards which Russia is so rapidly heading. Valuable material for studying the policy of the bourgeoisie is sometimes offered by Osvobozhdzhenia, published abroad, which is able to review the numerous public utterances of the Russian liberals without censorship restrictions. The program of the Osvobozhdzhenia League, which this journal has just published or reprinted from Novosti of April 5, with instructive commentaries by Mr. P.S., is an excellent addendum to the resolutions of the Zemstvo Congresses and to the Osvobozhdzhenia Liberals' draft constitution, of which we wrote in Viperiod number 18. Quote, the drafting and voting of this program, as Mr. P.S. justly remarks, is a big step towards the creation of a Russian constitutional democratic party. For the Russian liberals, this is unquestionably a big step, which stands out in the long list of liberal activities. Nevertheless, how little this big step of the liberals is, as compared with what is needed for building a real party, as compared even with what social democracy has already done to this end. The bourgeoisie has far greater freedom of legal expression than the proletariat, incomparably more intellectual forces and financial means, and far greater facilities for party organization. Yet we still have before us a, quote, party without an official name, without a common, distinct, and lucid program, without worked out tactics, without a party organization, a, quote, party which, according to the competent testimony of Mr. P.S., consists of the Zemstvo Group and the Osvobozhdzhenia League, i.e. of an unorganized conglomeration of individuals plus an organization. But perhaps the members of the Zemstvo Group are party members in the now famous sense that they accept the program and work under the control of a party organization, of a group of the Osvobozhdzhenia League. Such a conception of party membership is as convenient and suitable to the liberals, and as natural a part of the liberal political pattern, as it is alien to the whole spirit of social democracy. Such a conception of party, expressed not in written rules, but in the actual structure of that party, implies, among other things, that the organized members, i.e. the members of the Uzbek League, stand in their majority for a unicameral system, while at the same time rejecting it in their program, passing the whole question over in silence in deference to the unorganized membership, to the Zemstvo group, which favors a bicameral system. The balance of forces, one might say, is providential for the politically active bourgeoisie. The organized intellectuals propose, and the unorganized businessmen, moneybags, and capitalists dispose. While heartily welcoming the program of the Uzbek League, Mr. P.S. in principle defends both the vagueness, inadequacy, and incompleteness of the program, and its organizational haziness and silence on tactics, all for reasons of realpolitik. We shall revert to this incomparable conception, so singularly characteristic of the essence of bourgeois liberalism, and shall now proceed to examine the basic principles of the liberal program. The party, as we have said, has no official designation. Mr. P.S. calls it by the name under which I believe it goes in the columns of our legal newspapers of the liberal trend, namely Constitutional Democratic Party. Comment, these were later known as the Cadets. Unimportant though the question of name may appear at first glance, here too we immediately find material that explains why the bourgeoisie, unlike the proletariat, must content itself with political vagueness, and even defend it in principle. It must do this not only on account of the subjective moods or qualities of its leaders, but by reason of the objective conditions governing the existence of the bourgeois class as a whole. The name Constitutional Democratic Party immediately calls to mind the well-known adage that speech was given to man in order that he might conceal his thoughts. The name GDP was invented to conceal the monarchist nature of the party. Indeed, who does not know that this entire party, in the person both of its master section, the Zemstvo group, and of the Uzbek League, stands for the monarchy? Neither section so much as mentions the question of the republic, which they consider idle talk, while their draft constitution bluntly and unequivocally accepts the monarchy as the form of government. We have therefore to do with a party that advocates a constitutional monarchy, a party of constitutional monarchists. This is a fact of which there is not the slightest doubt, and which cannot be dismissed by any arguments about acceptance in principle of the idea of a republic, though we have heard no such arguments yet from the constitutional Democrats, since the issue is not acceptance of the republic purely in principle, but acceptance in practical politics, acceptance of the will to achieve the republic, and of the necessity to struggle for it. The fact is that the bourgeois gentlemen cannot call themselves by their real name yet, any more than they can go out into the street naked. They cannot tell the truth openly. They cannot speak out the truth, for that would mean admitting one of the most outrageous and pernicious of political privileges. It would mean admitting their anti-democratism. No bourgeoisie in struggle for political liberty can admit this, and not only because it would be disgraceful, scandalous, and indecent. Nothing is too indecent for bourgeois politicians where their interests are concerned, but their interests at the moment demand liberty. Liberty cannot be won without the people, and the backing of the people cannot be secured unless one calls oneself a democrat, i.e. an adherent of the rule of the people, unless one conceals one's monarchism. And so the class position of the bourgeoisie inevitably gives rise to an inherent instability and falsity in the very formulation of its basic political tasks. The struggle for freedom, for the abolition of the ancient privileges of the autocracy, is incompatible with the defense of the privileges of private property, since these privileges entail, quote, gentle handling of the monarchy. The real program of the monarchist constitution, therefore, is draped in the fine, airy raiment of a democratic constitution. And this embellishment of the program's real content with the display of tawdry tinsel is called realpolitik. Thus, the ideologist of the liberal bourgeoisie speaks with inimitable contempt and sublime self-complacency about the theoretical self-indulgence which the, quote, representatives of the extreme parties are practicing, as quoted in Uzbek number 69 to 70. The realpolitiker of the bourgeoisie does not want to indulge in talk or even in daydreams of the republic because they do not want to struggle for the republic. For this reason, however, they feel the irresistible urge to edify the people with the enticement of, quote, democracy. They do not want to deceive themselves with regard to their inability to renounce the monarchy, and so they must deceive the people by keeping silent about their monarchism. The name of a party, as can be seen, is not such an incidental and unimportant affair as one might think at first glance. Sometimes the very showiness and pretentiousness of the name betrays the inherent flaw in a party's entire program and tactical line. The deeper an ideologist of the big bourgeoisie feels himself devoted to the monarchy, the louder he calls upon heaven to witness that he is a democrat. The more an ideologist of the petty bourgeoisie reflects its instability and its incapacity to wage a consistent, steadfast struggle for the democratic revolution and for socialism, the more ardently he holds forth on the party of the socialist revolutionaries, of which it has been aptly said that its socialism is anything but revolutionary, and its revolutionariness anything but socialist. Comment here, the SRs, or Socialist Revolutionaries, were not a Marxist party. They had more in common with the Narodniks, or old populists. This was more of a peasant party than a proletarian party. They had some anti-capitalist views, but kind of their view was that the agrarian economy was sort of like the perfect state of things, and that capitalism was a deviation from that, so they kind of wanted to go back to the golden days of agrarianism. Anyway, Lenin said that the Marxists, or Social Democrats at that time, needed to declare war politically on the SRs, and there's a number of other readings about that. Anyway, continuing. All we need now is for the adherents of the autocracy to call themselves, as they have on more than one occasion attempted to do, the People's Party, and we shall have a complete picture of the metamorphosis which class interests undergo on political signboards. The signboard of the liberal bourgeoisie, or the program of the Osvo-Bojdennia League, starts, as befits a signboard, with a striking preamble. Quote, the Osvo-Bojdennia League finds that the grave external and internal crisis through which Russia is passing has become so acute at the present time that the people must take its solution into their own hands in conjunction with the other social groups opposed to the existing regime, unquote. And so, let the power pass into the hands of the people. Long live the autocracy of the people in place of the autocracy of the Tsar. Isn't that it, gentlemen? Isn't that what democratism demands? No, this is theoretical self-indulgence and a failure to understand practical politics. All power is now in the hands of the absolute monarchy. Ranged against it is the people, namely the proletariat and peasantry, who have launched the struggle, are waging it furiously, and very likely will maintain their zeal until they've completely overthrown the enemy. But ranged alongside the people are the, quote, other social groups, viz. Society, i.e. the bourgeoisie, the landowners, the capitalists, and the professional intelligentsia. Thus, the power is to be divided into three equal parts. 1/3 is to be left to the monarchy, another goes to the bourgeoisie, an upper house based on indirect and, as far as possible, actually unequal and non-universal suffrage, while the remaining third goes to the people, a lower house on the basis of suffrage that is universal, etc. This will be a square deal, providing adequate protection for private property and making it possible to use the organized power of the monarchy, the army, bureaucracy, and police against the people, should they show zeal for any of the, quote, unreasonable demands put forward by the, quote, representatives of the extreme parties out of sheer theoretical self-indulgence. This square deal, which reduces the revolutionary people to a harmless minority of 1/3, is presented as, quote, a radical reform on democratic principles, and not at all on the principles of monarchism or of bourgeois privilege. How is this deal to be put through? By means of honest brokerage. Mr. Struve predicted this long ago in his preface to the Witte Memorandum, when he said that it is always the moderate parties that gain from the intensification of the struggle between the extreme parties. The struggle between the autocracy and the revolutionary people is gaining in intensity. One has to maneuver between the one and the other, enlisting the support of the revolutionary people against the autocracy, with the enticement of democracy, and the support of the monarchy against the, quote, excesses of the revolutionary people. By skillful maneuvering, a deal like that should come off, with the bourgeoisie getting at least a third share in any case, while the shares allotted to the people and the autocracy would depend on the outcome of the decisive struggle between them. Whose backing should be sought most will depend on the exigencies of the moment, such as the essence of the huckstering tactics, that is to say, quote, practical politics. At present, all power is still in the hands of the autocracy. The thing to do, therefore, is to say that the people must take the power into their hands. The thing to do, therefore, is to call yourself a Democrat, to put forward a demand for, quote, the immediate convocation of a constituent assembly on the basis of suffrage that is universal, etc., for the purpose of drawing up a Russian constitution. The people now are unarmed, disunited, unorganized, and helpless in the face of the absolute monarchy. A popular constituent assembly will rally them and become a great force which will oppose the power of the Tsar. Only then, when the power of the Tsar and the united force of the revolutionary people confront each other, will the bourgeoisie have its day. Only then will it be possible to coordinate these two forces with positive chances of success and ensure the most advantageous result for the propertied classes. Such is the plan of the practical politicians of liberalism. Not a foolish plan at all. It deliberately provides for the preservation of the monarchy and the admission of a constituent assembly of the whole people only alongside of the monarchy. The bourgeoisie does not want to have the existing government overthrown or the monarchy replaced by a republic. Therefore, the Russian bourgeoisie, on the pattern of the German bourgeoisie of 1848, stands for a deal between the people and the throne. Such a policy can be successful only if neither of these parties engaged in the struggle. Either the people nor the throne is able to win the day, only if their strength is balanced. Then, and only then, will the bourgeoisie be able to join with the monarchy and keep a tight hold on the people, compel them to put up with 1/3 or perhaps 1/100th part of the power. The constituent assembly of the whole people will just be strong enough to make the Tsar grant a constitution, but it will not and must not, from the point of view of the bourgeoisie's interests, be any stronger than that. It must only counterbalance the monarchy, but not overthrow it. It must leave the material instruments of power, the army, etc., in the hands of the monarchy. The Osvobojdzenia Leaguers laugh at the Shapovists for wanting to give the Tsar the power of authority and the people the power of opinion. But is not their position essentially identical with that of the Shapovists? They do not want to give the people all the power either. They too stand for a compromise between the power of the Tsar and the opinion of the people. We thus see that the interests of the bourgeoisie as a class quite naturally and inevitably lead it at the present revolutionary moment to advance the slogan of a constituent assembly of the people, but in no case the slogan of a provisional revolutionary government. The first slogan is or has become the slogan of the policy of compromise, huckstering, and brokerage. The second is the slogan of revolutionary struggle. The first is the slogan of the monarchist bourgeoisie, the second, the slogan of the revolutionary people. The first slogan makes it possible chiefly to preserve the monarchy, despite the revolutionary onset of the people. The second offers the straight road to the republic. The first leaves the power with the Tsar, restricted only by public opinion. The second is the only slogan which consistently and unreservedly leads to the sovereignty of the people in the full sense of the word. Only this radical difference in the political aims of the liberal bourgeoisie and the revolutionary proletariat can explain a number of secondary features in the Osvobojdzenia program, besides those mentioned above. Only in the light of this difference is it possible to understand, for example, why the Osvobojdzenia adherents require the reservation that the decisions of their league are to be, quote, regarded as binding only insofar as political conditions remain unchanged, and that the program allows for, quote, a provisional and conditional element. This reservation, developed at length and with keen relish in the commentaries of Mr. P.S., is absolutely essential for a party of compromise between the people and Tsarism. It is a reservation that makes it as clear as daylight that in pursuance of their line of huckstering, or practical politics, the Osvobojdzenia Leaguers will throw over a good many of their democratic demands. Their program is not an expansion of steadfast convictions, a quality alien to the bourgeoisie, not something designated to be fought for. Rather, their program is simply a haggling price, fixed beforehand with a definite view to reduction, depending on which of the warring parties can hold out for longer. The constitutional democratic, read constitutional monarchist, bourgeoisie will strike a bargain with Tsarism at a cheaper price than its present program. There is no doubt of that, and the class-conscious proletariat should have no illusions on that score. Hence Mr. P.S.'s hostility towards the division into a minimum program and a maximum program, and toward, quote, firm decisions of program in general. Hence, his assurances that the program of the Ozba Bojdenia League, purposely couched not in terms of definite demands precisely formulated, but in the form of a literary, approximative description of demands, quote, is more than adequate for a party engaged in practical politics. Hence, the omission of any mention for the arming of the people in the program of the monarchist, quote, Democrats, the avoidance of any definitely formulated demand for the disestablishment of the church, the insistence on the impracticability of abolishing indirect taxes, the substitution of cultural self-determination of the oppressed nationalities for their political self-determination. Hence, the naively frank admission that democracy and the interests of capital are linked together, that instead of, quote, protection for enterprises and businessmen, there must be greater protection for the development of the productive forces of the people. Let that one sink in. That, quote, industrial prosperity, etc., must be promoted. Hence, the reduction of the agrarian reform to the level of a purely bureaucratic granting of land to the peasants, with an absolute guarantee that the landowners will be compensated for the lands assigned to the peasants. In other words, the sanctity of property derived from bondage and serfdom is to be upheld at all costs. All this, we repeat, is the natural and inevitable result of the position of the bourgeoisie as a class in modern society. All this confirms the radical difference between the proletarian policy of revolutionary struggle and the bourgeois policy of liberal brokerage. That is the end of this audiobook. So I think that this one was pretty straightforward. So early on in the Russian revolutionary struggle, really the first year that things broke out, Lenin here, on behalf of socialists everywhere, is trying to size up what's going on as far as the interests of the Tsar, the interests of the capitalists, and the interests of the revolutionary masses, who obviously are going to be struggling against the Tsar, the revolutionary masses are. But what are the capitalists going to try to do? We know from studying Marxism that capitalism follows feudalism, according to the laws of historical development. And so the capitalists are going to make a play at this. So they see that what does it take to actually overthrow the Tsar or to cut down the Tsar's power at any rate? Well, it takes the masses of the people to do that. The capitalists alone really can't do it. So the capitalists have to pretend to be these revolutionary Democrats to get the people on their side, really, so that the capitalists can just sort of position themselves on top. Or as Lenin is saying here, maybe the new arrangement will be a third of the power to the old feudal order, a third of the power in the government to the bourgeoisie, and then a third of the power to, the vast majority of the population. Basically, the monarchy loses, the capitalists gain, and the people gain a little bit, but not anywhere near in proportion to their numbers and what should happen. In other words, in a self-serving way, the bourgeoisie is trying to halt the revolution or cut the revolution in half so that, yes, the monarchy gets out of their way, but also the people don't get ahead of the capitalists and start doing some crazy socialist shit. We wouldn't want that. Well, actually, that is exactly what happened in Russia, because Lenin and others saw this from the very beginning, called it, strategized around it, and they were really successful. They did a lot of things right, and they were able to pull it off. It should be noted also that this is a pretty typical move by the capitalists, as could have been seen in other countries previously, where they pose as the freedom fighters who are going to liberate all the people. Then actually they cut a deal with the deposed feudal order and monarchy and all that to kind of stay around as sort of an anchor to prevent social change from going too far, which would of course go into the proletariat and maybe peasantry in the early days' favor. This is in a situation where the population hasn't undergone extensive proletarianization, and the working class isn't as big compared to the peasantry, things like that. But this idea of using the deposed feudal order as a kind of anchor working in the capitalist interest, because how does capitalism work? Well, capitalists exploit proletarians, and as their capital grows through that exploitation, the extraction of surplus value, more and more people have to go and work for them. So proletarianization spreads across the population just like a chemical reaction. The longer it runs, the more of the population turns proletarian, propertyless, dispossessed. The only commodity that they have to sell is labor, their own hands, so to speak. So that's what happens. The longer the capitalism is there, it proletarianizes the population, and that's what capitalists need to stay in wealth and power on top of society, maintaining their dictatorship over the vast majority of the people. This is, again, a phase of class society. The mode of production is capitalism. And what would happen if the proletariat were to depose the capitalists? Well, socialism. The beginning of the end of class society, in which the proletariat, now in charge of society, proletarianizes the capitalists and any other classes that haven't been proletarianized, leading to just one class, the end of class exploitation, and essentially then a class-less society, because there are no more class contradictions at that point, and that is our aim as communists. So anyway, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, patreon.com/socialismforall. Head there. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. It doesn't have to be recurring. You can sign up and then cancel. But the recurring support lets us plan how much we can do this. I would make content even if nobody contributed financially. However, this support allows me to spend a lot more time on the channel than I would be able to do without that support. So if you like the channel, thank a patron, consider becoming one. It's hugely helpful. It's encouraging and, again, materially helpful. Beyond that, like, share, subscribe. That engagement helps YouTube to share this content to other people. So even if you don't have a big social media channel to share the videos on, that engagement will at least help YouTube indirectly to show it to more people. The channel has been growing. I appreciate everybody's participation. We also do live streams, usually on Wednesdays over on Twitch, twitch.tv/socialisms4a. You can catch that currently at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. We're live for a few hours, and we go over the readings, we take questions, we do current events, and that kind of thing. So I appreciate everybody's participation. This has made it an active and vibrant community, and it keeps giving us new ideas, and it helps to ensure that the agitation, education can go on this channel. And of course, we encourage you also to get organized. That happens in real life. Get to know your local left, network with people, at least join something on a statewide or national level if there's absolutely nothing going on in your area. Although you might be surprised sometimes, there might be something you just haven't heard of it. Connecting with that statewide or national party might put you in touch with it. Anyway, we have to build up the left that we have, improve it, educate it, turn it into its best self, and then keep waging the class struggle. That struggle will sharpen class consciousness, will create a better vanguard, and that in turn will create better parties and organizations. I don't think that we have necessarily the party at this point that we need. Better struggle will create a better left, will create those better parties. Again, get out there, meet people, network. That's really where all of this happens in the end. All right, thanks again, and we will see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of the Revolutionary Army.
So, tomorrow morning, we will get back into this. This has been my daily routine of meditation, yoga, and martial arts, reading, listening to audiobooks. Tomorrow, we will listen to The Revolutionary Army and the Revolution by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And my name is Dan Baker. I am a sympathizer of the Revolutionary Communists of America. This is Pikachu the cat. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I encourage you to practice along with me and get out there and organize, protest, agitate. I'm a communist. I believe that is the best system, the best way forward for humanity. And that's why I'm doing this for free. This will always be free. I'll be sharing ideas, reading books, listening to audiobooks, and demonstrating so that you can practice along with my daily routine of reading, listening, meditation, yoga, martial arts.